Welcome to this session. My name is Milena Tripkovic. I'm a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Edinburgh Law School and also one of the associate directors of the SECJR. So today we have a presentation by Manuel Maroto Calatayud, who is a professor of criminal law and criminology at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid. And he is also currently a visiting researcher at Edinburgh Law School, where he has been for a few months working on a variety of issues connected to prisoner disenfranchisement and enfranchisement, and more widely working on participation of prisoners and convicted offenders in a political sense. So today he will be talking about, you can see the topic already, so I won't repeat it, but he will in general be talking about what happens when prisoners are enfranchised. And for those of us who are located in the UK, we know how big a struggle it is to get prisoners enfranchised. And we kind of, I think, seem to think that once they are enfranchised, that's the end of the road. They get their voting rights, so it's just a matter of voting. But as I think Manuel will speak to us today and try to explain today, that is not actually the end of the road, and there are many more things that need to be put in place to really secure that prisoners have the opportunity to exercise their vote. So he'll talk about a variety of different things as they pertain to enfranchisement in Spain. What we tend to do in these presentations, Manuel will speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then we will have the Q&A session. You are more than welcome to just raise your hand and ask a question, or you can also type in the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat so I can read out the question. So Manuel, the floor is yours. I will mute myself and please tell us everything.
Thank you so much, Milena. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to Milena and Rachel and the Scottish Center for Criminal Justice Research for inviting me to present some of the work I've been carrying out over the past few months as a visiting researcher at the University of Edinburgh. So as you see, today I will discuss the low electoral participation of enfranchised prisoners in Spain and explore some of the factors that may help explain it. Low voter turnout among the prisoners seem a pretty common feature in countries where prisoners are allowed to vote. Common but not universal by any means. In Scandinavian countries, for example, it's often said that they have a record of relatively high levels of participation among prisoners, and also some countries in the global south have achieved high turnout rates. In this slide, for example, you can see a series of figures from different countries. The case of Mexico is very significant and recent. In the voting rights were extended to remand prisoners to 2019 in Mexico, and in the 2024 elections, voter turnout among eligible prisoners reached 85% of the vote. This was probably linked to the fact that the abolition of prisión preventiva oficiosa, one of the automatic modes of preventive prison there, was one of the issues debated during the electoral campaign. But anyway, as for Spain, the possibility to restrict voting rights disappeared with a new criminal code in 1995. But today, voting in Spanish prisons still remains a largely marginal phenomenon. According to the very limited data available, voter turnout among prisoners typically ranges between 5% and 20%, although there is considerable variation on the election, the region, and the prison concerns. So, to explore the situation in Spain, we at the prison clinic of the University the Complutense University of Madrid, we designed a qualitative study based on semi-structured interviews with prisoners about voting and more broadly on political participation. The study was carried out as a part of a wider research project on social and political exclusion within the penal system led by Margarita Martínez de Escamilla at the Complutense University of Madrid. Between April and July 2023, we interviewed 84 people serving sentences in 7 ordinary prisons and 2 open prisons in the Madrid region. The interviews were conducted by a team of colleges and students from the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, some of whom, by the way, I consider connected today. In collaboration with the University of A Coruña and the Prison Transparency Project, we used some excerpts of the interviews to produce a podcast. It is available at the address you can see in the slide. It's currently only available in Spanish, but we hope to add English subtitles in the coming months if you are interested and well, you don't practice the Spanish. What I present today is drawn from the ongoing analysis of these interviews, which I've been carrying out during my stay at the University of Edinburgh over the last 3 months. I've coded roughly 70% of the interviews so far. So these findings should be regarded as strictly preliminary. I'm going to focus on 3 dimensions that might help understand voting and non-voting in prison. The first concern the first concerns the informational and bureaucratic barriers that may discourage eligible prisoners from voting. The second relates to the experience of imprisonment itself and how prison life, prison socialization may shape decisions about voting. The third dimension concerns broader social and personal factors that predate imprisonment and may also contribute to political disengagement and abstention. I'm actually going to start to begin with this third dimension, partly because it also allows me to highlight some of the limitations of the study that are also relevant to understanding some of the findings. So, social and personal factors and how that was part of the limitations of the study. The recruitment of participants for the study in the interviews was not under our control. In some prisons, participants were partly directly recruited directly by prison staff, but in most of the cases, participation was out of the initiative of the prisoners. We distributed posters to the prisons where the study was authorized and asked them to be displayed on notice boards across the different prison wings. That's the poster you can see in the slide. These posters explained that we were conducting a university study on politics in prison and invited people currently serving sentences to speak with us about politics and voting, regardless of whether they were interested in politics or not. Unsurprisingly, this produced a strong selection bias. Those who volunteered were in most cases people who already had some interest in politics, often with a high educational level. Almost half of those interviewed held one university degree. Many had completed secondary education, and only a relatively small proportion had completed primary education alone. So this clearly was not representative of the Spanish prison population, actually not even of the general population of Spain. At the same time, the limitation turned out to be quite revealing of how the dynamics of political inclusion and exclusion inside and outside prison are very similar. As Cormac Behan observed in his study of Irish prisons, voting patterns among prisoners tend to reflect broader social patterns. Older, better educated, more trusting citizens, and those with a established habit of voting are more likely to participate electorally. This continuity between political identity outside and inside prison was evident throughout the interviews. In fact, somehow contrary to our expectations as researchers, only a minority of participants told us that imprisonment had significantly altered their political views or attitudes. For the most part, people who voted before entering prison continued to vote while in prison, and those who had not voted before incarceration were generally unlikely to begin voting once inside. A majority of participants expressed that prison had not fundamentally changed who they were, that they maintained the same values and political beliefs, and often the same party preferences they had held before imprisonment. In later discussions with other members of the research team, particularly with Ana Ballesteros, we reflected on the fact that we may have approached the interviews with a particular assumption that entering prison represents a sharp break, definitive, defining before and after moment in a person's life. And what the interviews suggested, however, was something rather different. For most participants, there were a strong sense of continuity between who they were politically outside and inside prison. In other words, we approached them as prisoners talking about politics, but they answered not as prisoners, but as people they were outside, as the people they were outside of prison. So this first dimension appears to be important in explaining low electoral participation. Most people serving sentences in prison come from social groups that are already less likely to vote and engage in politics. Some studies suggest that this is the most important explanatory factor for low turnout, and this could be true in the Spanish case as well. But having said that, let me now turn to the other two dimensions, because while political behavior in prison largely reflects patterns that exist outside prison, imprisonment also creates specific conditions that clearly affect voting and political engagement. So, during the interviews, several concrete obstacles to voting emerged. The first issue concerns information on eligibility. As I mentioned earlier, prisoners cannot be deprived in Spain from the right to vote since 1995. Nevertheless, a substantial proportion of the people we interviewed believed that they were not entitled to vote. The main source of confusion appears to be the fact that many sentences include the deprivation of the right to passive suffrage, that is, the right to stand for election, which remains a common accessory penalty in Spain. Around 63,000 people were subject to this penalty in 2024. This confusion between restriction of active and passive suffrage was not limited to participants with low levels of education. We encountered it among highly educated interviewees as well, including, at least in one case, in someone with a law degree. This finding is consistent with a wider pattern of misinformation surrounding voting rights in prison. In fact, official sources of information appear to contribute to the confusion in Spain. Several government websites that provide information on voting procedures still contain references to the possibility of being deprived of the right to vote. In some cases, it seems that electoral guidance has simply been reproduced from regulations dating back from the 80s. In practice, when an election is approaching, prisoners are informed about their voting rights through a notice posted on the wing notice board, alongside with many other announcements and administrative documents. There are no meetings or informative sessions explaining voting rights or the procedures for voting from prison. Many participants told us that it is common simply to ignore what is posted on the notice boards. In fact, our own recruitment poster was displayed on those same notice boards, and a small number of participants signed up for the study believing that they would be casting their vote while speaking to us. That gives some indication of the level of confusion surrounding the voting process. So a second issue concerns information about postal voting itself. Several participants raised concerns about the privacy of their vote. More specifically, some were worried about voting from prison as something that could reveal their imprisonment to people in their local communities once their ballot reached the electoral authorities in the municipality where they were registered. Well, for many prisoners, incarceration is something they actively try to keep private from neighbors, employers, in some cases even friends or relatives. So any procedure that appears capable of revealing that information may therefore discourage participation. Strictly speaking, this shouldn't be a problem because the external envelope of the vote does not indicate that the vote originates from a prison. However, the envelope also contains the certificate of registration in the electoral census, so the concern about revealing details about incarceration is understandable. The third group of obstacles is bureaucratic. A significant one is related to the registration of residence, which is required to be included in the electoral census. Some prisoners are not registered at any address outside prison. This can occur for different reasons. In some cases, they were never registered. In others, they lost their registration after entering prison. This affects migrants who had not registered a resident in Spain, but also people in general who lived, for example, in rentals before imprisonment and whose registration was cancelled after incarceration. Several participants were unsure where they registered or even whether they were registered at all. In principle, prisons are allowed to register prisoners as residents at the prison itself, but in practice, however, this appears to happen only very rarely. Deadlines for postal voting can also create additional difficulties. If information about the electoral timetable is not communicated sufficiently early, prisoners may miss important stages of the process, particularly when unexpected delays occur. For example, some participants explained that they were unable to vote because the electoral documentation had been sent to the registered address, their registered address outside prison, rather than to the prison itself, meaning that they did not receive the materials in time. At this point, it's important to make a distinction. Most participants did not consider the voting procedure itself to be especially complicated. On the contrary, many describe it as very straightforward once you understand the steps involved. However, participants frequently felt that prison administrations made very little or not effort to promote electoral participation or to ensure that prisoners understood their rights beyond posting notices on the notice boards and informing prisoners that they could request a postal vote. This is noteworthy because the regulations governing voting in prison in Spain state that electoral rules should be made available to prisoners and that information sessions should be organized to explain and clarify the voting process. Yet only a handful of participants reported ever attending to something like that. So, misinformation about eligibility, uncertainty about voting procedures, bureaucratic obstacles, and institutional indifference. These are all good reasons to argue that there are elements of de facto disenfranchisement in Spain that continue to persist in the prison system. The final dimension I would like to discuss is less about formal barriers to voting, formal or informal barriers, and more about the institutional environment in which voting takes place. Prisons are often highly hierarchical and authoritarian forms of organization characterized by limited autonomy. The right to vote may formally exist there, but it is exercised within an environment that where many of the conditions that normally sustain democratic participation are absent. In that sense, voting in prison could be, in some respects, comparable to voting in a non-democratic society. For some individuals, this may discourage participation. For others, it may have the opposite effect, turning voting into a symbolic act of resistance or self-assertion. Let me briefly discuss a few examples. An important question is whether prison provides any meaningful space for political conversations. The interviews revealed a variety of views on this issue, but there was also some significant degree of agreements. Most participants, for example, told us that politics are discussed in prison, but only with a relatively small number of people. According to many respondents, only a minority of prisoners would have a real interest in political issues or could engage in interesting conversations. For most, the pressures and routines of prison life took precedence. Participants often describe fellow prisoners as focusing their attention on immediate concerns, visits from family members, temporary leaves, progression through the prison regime, or simply getting through daily life. One often they mention the widespread use of legal and illegal drugs as a way of coping with incarceration and as one of the main explanations of political apathy. Interestingly, this sometimes created unusual interactions. Ideological differences could become less important than having someone with whom political discussions or just engaging conversations were possible at all. So several respondents, for example, described conversations with political offenders or white-collar offenders as particularly valuable. A second issue concerns the broader separation of prison from society. Imprisonment involves not only physical separation, but also a sense of symbolic and political exclusion. Most respondents told us that they felt forgotten by society and completely ignored by politicians. But at the same time, prisoners continue to consume political information. In Spain, prisoners are allowed to have televisions in their cells, provided they can pay for them. And television is by far the main source of political news mentioned in the interviews. One thing that surprised us was how closely many participants follow public debates and current affairs. Their concerns and discourses, including on issues related to criminal justice, often closely resemble those being discussed outside prison. However, access to other sources of information was more restricted. Newspapers provide a good example. Many respondents reported having no regular access to newspapers at all. Others described a very similar situation in different prisons. Newspaper would first be read by prison officers and would only reach prisoners if staff decided to pass them on. This was despite the fact that newspapers are in principle supposed to be available through prison libraries. One particularly interesting theme concerning politicians and other high-profile offenders serving prison sentences is the following one. Several respondents reported that politicians imprisoned for corruption and political offenses receive more favorable treatment from prison authorities than ordinary prisoners. This contributed to a broader sense of unfairness and reinforced feelings of disconnection from the political system outside prison. In other words, many participants felt simultaneously underrepresented by the politicians outside prison and confronted with what they perceived to be privileged treatment of politicians inside prison. A third theme that emerged very clearly from the interviews was the incapacitation for collective action. Complaints within prison must be made individually through the filling of a form addressed to the prison administration. When we asked whether prisoners could collectively, for example, sign complaints or petitions, a significant number of interviewees replied that such actions would be treated as a form of mutiny and potentially trigger disciplinary proceedings. While no provision in Spanish prisons regulations define the submission of collective complaints as an infraction, even less as a mutiny, this was reported repeatedly across participants in different prisons. More broadly, many participants reported that complaining or protesting were very high-risk activities that one should avoid in prison. They often described the potential reprisals ranging from violence by prison staff in some cases, and much more often delays in obtaining leave for progression through the prison regime or transfers to less desirable wings or to different prisons altogether. So this issue may seem unrelated to voting, yet I think that the interviews suggest a subtle connection. When we asked participants what voting meant to them, both inside and outside prison, a common response was, if you don't vote, then you have not the right to complain. This is, of course, a very familiar idea, but in prison it seems to take a different meaning, since opportunities to complain are indeed severely restricted. For some prisoners, this makes voting more meaningful, a symbolic gestures of voice and choice. For others, however, voting can appear largely empty, a symbolic exercise in participation within a setting where they have no influence over the conditions of their lives. Finally, let me conclude with some reflections on participation in prison governments. Over the last 2 decades, many Spanish prisons have established at least one wing known as Módulo de Respeto, it's a so-called Respect wing. These units are designed around principles of self-organization, with prisoners taking responsibility for many aspects of everyday life in the wing. To facilitate this, these units often operate through assemblies in which prisoners can discuss issues, elect representatives, and stand for various positions of responsibility. On the surface, this arrangement draws heavily on the language of democratic participation. However, when asked about these structures, respondents would often not identify those forms of participation as political in any sense. Rather, they view them as practical obligations for managing daily life in prison, organizing cleaning duties, coordinating activities, or resolving interpersonal conflicts. But some participants did nevertheless see these assemblies as a form of proto-politics comparable to the governance of a small community or village. And well, importantly, even within these models, collective protest and organized freedom of association and expression remained largely absent. Still, many respondents who live in these units report having better access to information, including information about voting procedures and electoral participation. So, well, I think I'm out of time already. So, yeah, let me finish just by opening the discussion and saying that, well, taking all this together, the central question, at least in the Spanish cases, might be not why prisoners vote or not, but rather how can prisons provide the minimal conditions necessary for democratic participation to have any meaningful substance. I really look forward to discuss these issues with you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Manuel. This was super interesting for me, and I have a couple of questions, but I will not abuse my position. I'll wait until the end. Great. So I'm happy to open the Q&A. Welcome.